Good morning, and to some of you, welcome. To some of you, welcome back for this third day and the final morning of our conference on 15th century printing revolution. This morning, our overarching theme is illustration and digital tools, and I think we have some exciting things to look at and to see. Okay. I will warn you that we'll have two papers, and then we're going to change the seats up here. So there will be about a 1-minute switch so that all the speakers can come up on the platform. Our first speaker, when she returns to the platform with her lecture, is Professor Lilian Armstrong from Wellesley College in Massachusetts. We're very pleased that such senior scholars as Lilian and Susie have made the opportunity to come to speak to us about their work. Lilian's topic is the decoration and illustration of Venetian Incunabula, from hand-illumination to the design of woodcuts. Lilian.
You have to work out. Thank you, Bill, for the gracious introduction. And I also wish to thank Christina Dondi and all the members of her team for including me in this conference, and for all the help and friendship that they have given me over the years of the 15th century book trade. Many thanks also to the many colleagues who have sent to me images that I will be showing this morning. The topic that I've been asked to address is relatively well known to art historians who are specialists in the study of illuminated manuscripts, but less well known to incunabulists. That is, the phenomenon of the hand-illuminated Venetian incunabulum and the trajectory from hand decoration to the illustration of printed books with woodcuts. This broad artistic phenomenon can be conveniently divided into three segments, roughly corresponding to the early 1470s, the later 1470s and 1480s, and eventually to the 1490s. Now, I think this is, okay, yes. As many of you know, the first printing press in Venice, that of Johannes de Spira, opened in 1469, to be rapidly followed by many others. The period 1469 to 74 was dominated by two presses, that of de Spira brothers and that of Nicholas Jensen. Although printers soon began to develop aesthetic principles of their own, the initial publications echoed that layout of contemporary manuscripts. As you can see by comparing a Cicero manuscript written in Florence in 1411 with an Augustinus de Civitate Dei printed by de Spira brothers in 1470, scribes and early printers alike designed their pages with wide margins, gaps between the significant segments of the text awaiting captions, and indented lines of text where the large capital letters could be added by hand. For the printed Augustinus, a scribe has already provided rubrication in this copy, now faded, but no large initials have been added, nor has any decoration been painted in the generous margins. I will use further copies of the 1470 Augustinus as my case study for the 1470s. Thousands of books printed in the 1470s were finished with initials and borders painted or hand-illuminated by artists known as miniaturists or illuminators. For the copy in Treviso, now seen on the left, a miniaturist has painted a decorative white vine, Bianchi Girari, borders in 3 margins. He's inserted initials in gold and also enhanced with white vine, and has provided a space in the lower margin for the potential owner's coat of arms. What is critical to understand is that, this decoration must have been executed by a professional artist who was trained in draftsmanship in order to draw the lively satyrs, and also specifically trained in the technical processes of applying gold and egg tempera to paper or parchment. In this particular case, the artist can be identified as Giovanni Van Ramin, a well-known miniaturist who illuminated many incunabula for Jacopo Zeno, Bishop of Padua. On the screen now are 10 more copies of this same edition out of the 98 extant copies of the 1470 De Spira Augustinus. I'm aware of 27 that are hand-illuminated. These 10 examples all have borders painted by Venetian or North Italian miniaturists who have added gold initials and white vine borders to 2 or 3 or 4 of the margins. Often a wreath has been provided in the lower margin to encircle the coat of arms, frequently never added. It is also important to consider the evidence of copies that were sent to Northern Europe and decorated in styles to which their buyers would be accustomed. These 3 of the 1470 Augustinus show non-Italian illumination, confirming to us the international aspect of the book trade. This was also a period of intense experimentation. On the left is a 1470 Augustinus with lively centaurs in the lower margin that have been originally designed by a miniaturist known as the Pootie Master. The artist made a tracing from a master drawing and then painted the design. We know about this process because several other incunabula that exist that have exactly the same centaurs in their borders, such as the Livy on 1470 on the right, where the creatures have been traced again, thus speeding up the process of decoration by hand. The second experimental technique, probably also intended to speed the process of decoration, was to enhance the margins of individual copies with woodcuts stamped by hand. To create a woodcut, an artist must first make a design on a flat surface of a narrow strip of wood. The wood is then carved to leave the raised lines of the design, which can be inked and stamped, and the resulting pattern could then be painted with colors. 3 copies of the Augustinus suggest the popularity of this technique. The Pootie and Rabbit in the lower margins of the 2 pages on the right employ the same wood block. The inner margins reveal the similar sequence of oval patterns. The colors then applied after the pattern have been stamped, but the colors differ. Many of these motifs were catalogued by Lamberto Donati in the 1970s and were further explored by Suzy Marquand in 1986. For the period 1469 to 74, I've records of over 130 books that incorporate these borders, just from the De Spira brothers and from Nicholas Jensen. Curiously, after 1474, this technique for speeding up the production of finished copies was abandoned. I wish to emphasize that the sheer numbers of hand-illuminated incunabula executed in Venice in the early 1470s is very significant. For the years 69 to 74, I'm aware of 546 surviving hand-illuminated books from the De Spira and Jensen's alone. And surely one would be reasonable to double this number if calculating lost copies. So say 1,000 books in this 5-year period, or 200 Venetian incunabula hand-illuminated every year. Regardless of what mechanisms were for commissioning the work, there had to be an influx of professional miniaturists to execute this decoration. In the later 1470s and 1480s, Venetian editions were much larger, and presumably the percentage of copies that were hand-illuminated was lower. Nevertheless, miniaturists continue to decorate bespoke copies of particular patrons, and hundreds of Venetian Incunabula continued to be modestly illuminated by hand. As a generalization for this period, it appears that law texts and liturgical texts, especially Bibles and breviaries, were most extensively hand-illuminated. For the period mid-1470s onwards, Venetian printers were avidly supplying canon and civil law for texts at the universities, as we heard in the splendid paper by Alessandra yesterday. Printers followed the layout for their latex that had been firmly established in the manuscript tradition of the 14th century. That is, the core text of canon or civil law in 2 columns, surrounded by commentary, also in 2 columns. Almost always, a large space was reserved for a miniature at the beginning of the text. The miniatures usually showed the relevant pope for canon law, or the Emperor Justinian for civil law, surrounded by cardinals or courtiers, while being presented with the text by the author. As you can see on the right in the Marciana, 1480 Gratianus, illuminated by the Pico Master. Hand-illumination may be said to have reached its spectacular apex around 1480 with the law books decorated for the German aristocratic merchant Petrus Ugelheimer, by some of the most outstanding miniaturists of the era. These 2 extraordinary frontispieces can be assigned to Benedetto Padovano on the left and to Girolamo da Cremona on the right. The fictive parchment pages appear to be suspended in front of fanciful architectural structures loaded with jewels. The 2 miniatures show Justinian and Supplicant and a papal audience on the other side, while satyrs and centaurs romp in the grassy foreground. Dozens of Bible editions printed in Venice in the 15th century were printed there. Bibles in Latin, Bibles in Italian, and multi-volume Bibles with a massive commentary of Nicholas of Lyra. As with the law Incunabula, the Biblia Latina editions settled into an often repeated format: 2 columns of Gothic type with generous spaces left preceding St. Jerome's letter to Frater Ambrosius. Miniatures provided St. Jerome for this area in the center image, and elaborate borders if requested. In many printed Bibles, the opening of Genesis was also illuminated. In the Newberry Library copy on the right, God the Father appears twice, first beside the gold eye of In Principio, blessing the globe, and again in the lower margin in God creating Eve from the side of Adam. The page layout for Bibles with commentary was necessarily more complex, resembling law texts at which we looked earlier. For the hand-illuminated copy of a 1481 edition in Paris, St. Jerome in Penitence has been relegated to the lower margin, and the other margins astonishingly are filled with mythological creatures in the Bible. On the right, the printer has left blank an area in the text of Nicholas of Lyra's commentary, anticipating that an artist, as in this case, will supply the correct image by hand. By the early 1490s, printers and miniaturists alike had realized that finishing the thousands of books that were being printed was an impossibility. Artists turned to designing woodcuts which could be inserted into the same matrix as the lines of type, printed simultaneously with the text, thus ensuring that every copy of a given edition was decorated. Woodcut illustrations had appeared, of course, in a few German editions in the 1470s, but did not become enthusiastically accepted by Venetian printers and patrons until the 1490s. Two miniaturists dominated the design of woodcuts in this period in Venice: the Pico Master, that is A.M. Hind's popular master, and Benedetto Bordone, Hind's classical master. The Pico Master derives his name from the Pliny manuscript that he illuminated for Pico della Mirandola in 1481 in the Marciana. He designed several elaborate borders, one of which you see on the right, framing a livy, which was published in 1493. The fragile putti, satyrs, and sea creatures, the classical cuirass held up on poles, trophies hanging on strings, are all motifs that indicate that the miniaturist was the designer of the woodcut. There were also small illustrations. The Pico Master designed at least some of the 420 small woodcuts in the livy. For some of the images, there are hand-illuminated precedents. In a pen and ink watercolor miniature of 1480, the Pico Master has vividly illustrated Livy's account of Hannibal's success in terrifying the Roman soldiers who had nearly trapped his army by encountering the enemy with cattle with flaming branches on their heads. The 1493 woodcut elaborates this scene by including the attackers and the fleeing foot soldiers. One should note that the woodcutters required to execute the hundreds of woodcuts in this and in other editions also represent a significant workforce necessary for Venetian book production. Also, Benedetto Bordone designed woodcut borders inspired by his manuscripts. For the presentation copy on vellum of the Lucian that he edited and published in 1494, Bordone painted an exquisite border with classicizing motifs in gold on a blue background. For all the other copies of the edition, Bordone designed an elegant woodcut border, similar motifs appearing in white on black ground. And for the great choir books, printed by Luca Antonio Giunta around 1500, Bordone designed woodcuts that echoed his miniatures for contemporary liturgical manuscripts, as in these woodcut and antiphonal copies. These many woodcut compositions are works of art in themselves, but also have the possibility of being repeated and in other editions, a phenomenon that Matilde Malaspina will be discussing shortly. In any case, the proverbial handwriting was on the wall, and the era of the hand-illuminated incunabula was coming to a close. As a postscript, I would like to say that a number of art historians for a long time have been presenting the riches of hand-illuminated Venetian incunabula. In Hermans Catalogue of 1931, 94 of his 152 entries were hand-illuminated incunabula. In my generation, Giordana Mariani Canova, Angela de Limbusi, Jonathan Alexander, and I all included high proportions of incunabula in our publications. More recently, important catalogs stress hand-illuminated incunabula, thus supplying more visual material. Links to ISTC and GW and MEI are also invaluable sources, making this material far more available. In my opinion, it is crucial that scholars of the book trade incorporate into their studies the economic and social implications of this important but understudied aspect of the Venetian book trade. Thank you.